This week marks 100 years since the birth of John F. Kennedy. He was born May 29, 1917, in Brookline. At 29 years old, he became a congressman, then soon after a senator, and at age 43, he became the youngest person ever elected to the presidency, only to be assassinated less than 3 years into his term. This past weekend, crowds packed the JFK Library in Dorchester and gathered outside the house he was born in for a centennial celebration. Joining me now is JFK's great-nephew, Congressman Joe Kennedy. Congressman, it's good to see you.
Mr. Browdy, always a pleasure.
Everybody has a different thing or moment they think about when they think about JFK. What's yours? I know you weren't born at the time, but...
Look, I think, Jim, I have all of those, I think, like many Americans, those public images of him that was out there that he's well known for, his speeches, his inaugural address. But I think what most people don't necessarily think of when they think of President Kennedy was the fact that he was a dad and a son and a brother and a father. And so the pieces that I think of about him are, you know, the pictures of him and other family members up at my grandmother's home. Some of the writings and letters that my father happened to be President Kennedy's godson. Some of the papers that he still has up on our wall.
Your father, Congressman
father,
Joe Kennedy, for those who aren't aware.
But he was a president, and he's somebody that I think inspired an awful lot of people across this country and around the world. He's also a person, and the personal part is the part that I continue to follow.
You know, the timing is either great or horrible for this 100th anniversary. And last week on the radio, we spoke to Doug Brinkley, a presidential historian, your cousin, Stephen Kennedy Smith, who did this JFK book, Tom Oliphant, Curtis Wilkie. In every conversation, it wasn't 2 seconds in until we were starting to compare JFK's presidency with Donald Trump's presidency. Does that not, when you're thinking Bay of Pigs, when you're thinking sense of humor, when you're thinking JFK's huge brain, do you not make those comparisons too?
No, look, I think obviously I have my differences with this administration. I'm not going to speak of what a family member, certainly one that's not here to correct me, would say of an administration or an issue or anything else. I do think, though, that the vision that President Kennedy had for America, the way that he tried to practice politics, recognizing that there are connections that we share as Americans, as human beings, that I think real leadership finds those connections, strengthens them, celebrates them, and channels them to take on a big challenge. I don't think that's the way the current President of the United States addresses politics, the way that he approaches the American people. That's a decision that this president can make. It is up to those of us that feel differently about it to make the case as to why that vision is not going to be in the best interest of our people going forward.
So you've made the case pretty powerfully, particularly, I would argue, in health care. When Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, referred to that repeal that would have cost 24 million people their health insurance,
Still might.
He referred to it as an act of mercy. You had a response to that act of mercy. What was it?
That bill is an act of malice. It's not an act of mercy. Look, put the details of a policy aside. When you look at the challenges that our healthcare system faces across the nation, and they are real, but when you define success as taking healthcare away from 23 million people, when you define it as gutting what insurance actually means, the quality of the care that's actually delivered, and destroying it, when you say that we can pass a $600 billion tax cut onto the wealthy by cutting $880 billion for healthcare for families that are working paycheck to paycheck, for families that are in need of mental behavioral health care, for folks in need of long-term care, for folks in need of prescription drug coverage. That's what this bill does, and that's not who we are as a nation. It's not who we are as a people, and America can do better than that. And for anybody, for a member of Congress to think that the promise that we make to each other about health care, that it's going to be there for you in a time of need, to think that that's as good as America can do, I'm sorry, but I disagree.
What do you think of Charlie Baker's response to what this health care bill has looked like? Either the one that, well, primarily the one that came out of the House.
Look, I think the governor understands that this could be, if passed, will be devastating for the impact of Massachusetts. And I acknowledge and I recognize him for speaking up on it. The bottom line, though, is that Massachusetts is the leader in the nation when it comes to health care reform. And we need folks here, regardless of party, because regardless of party, this bill is going to destroy what health care means for all Americans. We need folks to be able to stand up, speak out, and say, And
yeah, but has he not done anything you would have wanted him to do? It seems to me he's been pretty outspoken.
I think he has been outspoken. I think that he's raised his voice on it. I think that he has a unique opportunity to explain to other members, Republican leaders, senators, and governors across the country as to what this bill will do to their state, what it will do for health care across the country. And I would encourage him to continue to raise his voice on this as we are in a pivotal phase here in the U.S. Senate.
Speaking of health, and I know you're concerned about mental health issues too, did you read the piece in this Globe adjunct stat about the change in Donald Trump's speech patterns, the way he speaks? And a bunch of neuroscientists who were interviewed said that in their minds, they were signs of cognitive decline?
I have not. I'm a stat fan. I read their newsletter every morning, but I didn't see that piece.
What's your reaction to that?
I'm not going to get into a psychoanalysis of or neurological analysis of the president.
Do you do it in private?
No, I don't, because I think regardless of that analysis, there's plenty of reason to criticize.
Okay, you're not a doctor, but you're a lawyer, and you were a prosecutor in your former life.
Yep.
Has he obstructed justice? I know you were a state prosecutor, but you understand federal law too. Based on what you know that's been reported in the Post and the Times, CNN, is he guilty of obstruction of justice, Donald Trump?
I also know that by being a prosecutor, you never judge a case before you get to a final verdict on it. And I will say, Jim, I have very strong concerns based on what is publicly available that you could certainly make a credible case that he did obstruct justice. The bottom line on this, you're a defense attorney, I know as well.
Not much of one, but go ahead.
We have a system of justice out there for a reason. The facts have to come out. It's why American public needs to have faith and confidence in the process and in the inquiry that needs to take place to understand whether the President of the United States actually broke a federal law. And I think it's critical for all of us to understand. The crux of this inquiry here is whether President Trump decided to put his interests and the interests of his family in front of the interests of the American people. And there's enough challenges out there that Americans are facing, keeping a roof over their head and food on their plate, their kids in school, that you should never have to worry whether the President of the United States has their back.
And you don't have an opinion on whether he's crossed that line?
I have grave concerns that he has. That investigation, though, needs to play out, which is why we need to have confidence in the way that that investigation is held.
Speaking of the justice system, one connection you and I have, when I was young and irresponsible, I was legal services lawyer, as you know, in the South Bronx. You're doing something, and by the way, for those who don't know, in Donald Trump's budget, there's a proposal to zero out funding for civil legal services for the poor. You're doing a really interesting thing, I think, with a Republican, Trey Gowdy, of all people. What are you trying to pull off here, Congressman?
So, look, access to justice is and should be an issue that affects people regardless of party, Democrat or Republican. There are, in fact, some lawyers in Congress, Republicans, that feel the same way. And so we have penned a letter together to try to make sure that there's actually no reliable data out there in the federal government to understand how folks that can't afford legal counsel, how that's impacted them when they end up in federal court. And so we're trying to get some more information about that so that we can, my hope would be, actually plush up and strengthen the legal the legal backstop we have to ensure that everybody actually gets equal justice under law, which is, Jim, the promise that we're supposed to make. It's etched in stone above the Supreme Court. And two, and I know you know this, but back in 2014, we as a society spent more on Halloween costumes for our pets than we did on access to legal services, basic field grants. Halloween costumes for our pets. We can do better.
And by the way, for those who don't know out there, while you're entitled to a lawyer, if you have a serious criminal matter, if you're about to lose your apartment or your kid or whatever, you may not be. You know, interestingly, just as an aside to complete this loop, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan proposed abolition for legal services for the poor, the one single most responsible person for its preservation was another great uncle of yours, Ted Kennedy. It was unbelievable. So all this bad news on the Trump front, his numbers are atrocious. Democrats, it seems to me, are making hay of nothing. There have been 3 congressional races. Montana, Republicans win. South Carolina, Republicans win. Most money ever spent in a congressional race in Georgia. And the Democrat led in the opening round, but hasn't won either. If Trump's so horrible, why are the American people still picking Republicans to represent them in Congress?
So I think a couple things there, Jim. First, these races, remember, they're special elections to fill Republican seats that were nominated to the cabinet. So these are Republican districts.
Yeah, one guy body slammed a reporter, and he's still going to be your colleague in the Congress.
8 hours before the polling actually started.
Right.
So, look, I think going back and Monday morning quarterback on all of these races isn't going to be helpful to anybody, other than I think recognizing the fact that these are conservative seats that were selected by a White House to make sure that there would be conservative members that would still be there. Now, look, that was a race in Montana, I believe, where Donald Donald Trump won that state by 22 points,
yeah,
and his candidate won by 4. So you are seeing a huge closure in these races. This Georgia race that you point to that is so close, now neck and neck, that's a state that was, this was Newt Gingrich's old seat, this was Johnny Isaac's old seat.
Democrats still haven't won a seat.
Right, but it was Barack Obama lost that seat to Mitt Romney by 22 points. Hillary Clinton lost it by 1. So we'll see.
One last question for you. You were here in May of 2015 sitting next to a buddy of yours, Seth Moulton,
Yeah.
and I asked you about your candidate for Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. Here's what you said then, Congressman.
I am a supporter of Leader Pelosi. I've been in the rooms with her over the course of the past couple of years. Her advocacy for democratic values, what she does in terms of leading this party, there's a reason why she's a leader.
Okay, it's 2 years later. I would argue that that's part of the problem. That what Republicans say is you give the Democrats the House, and that's the next speaker, Nancy Pelosi. Is she still the right person to lead Democrats in the House of Representatives?
I've got full faith and confidence in Leader Pelosi. I have been in more rooms with her in those past couple of years. There is no one that I have confidence in, or greater confidence in, to fight for the American public and the values of the American people under Republican leadership here, under the leadership of Donald Trump, and to make sure that we do the best we possibly can under very tough circumstances. It's where she's at her best. And Jim, look, when you're at a point where, in our nation, where healthcare is under attack, the values of our democracy are under attack, alliance on NATO and some of the most basic structures of our international and foreign policy are under attack, having Leader Pelosi there, I think is a great asset for the Democratic Party and for the country.
Will you send Trey Gowdy my best?
I most certainly shall.
Thanks so much, Congressman.